Welcome to the Thomistic Institute podcast. Our mission is to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university, the church, and the wider public square. The lectures on this podcast are organized by university students at Thomistic Institute chapters around the world. To learn more and to attend these events, visit us at thomisticinstitute.org.
So anyone know what this is? Anyone know what that is? All right, good. I just want to make sure. Okay. Yes, this is the human brain. This is a real picture of a brain. And so you're kind of looking down on it from above. Yeah, so I've spent a lot of my life so far dedicated to studying this organ. And it doesn't look all that impressive when you just look at it, but there's 86 billion neurons in there, and there's quadrillions of connections, and then there's billions and billions of support cells in there. So it may well be the most complex thing in the known universe. So it's a really amazing organ. No one understands it completely. The complexity of the brain is beyond our grasp and likely always will be. So it is a joy to study it. So we're going to be talking about this today, and we're going to kind of be discussing some claims in Christianity in general and then in Catholicism in particular about our human nature and what neuroscience maybe has to say about those and trying to find some common ground. So I want to start a little bit by talking about the scientific revolution, which began in the 16th and then really started taking off in the 17th century. So there was a lot of major players, and so there's like Copernicus, and for a long time there was a view of what's called geocentrism, where the Earth was the center of the universe, and Copernicus challenged that. The telescope hadn't been invented yet, but he challenged that was probably not the case, that the sun was the center of the known universe. That was in 1543. The telescope was invented a few decades after that, and then Galileo started to make modifications to the telescope and was able to see the moons of Jupiter and was able to confirm a lot of what Copernicus had to say. And then there's Kepler with the planetary laws of planetary motion. Francis Bacon was one of the major players in developing what we now call the scientific method. So he was one of the first people to start talking about that. Isaac Newton was in the 17th century. Boyle, Robert Hooke with the microscope, so seeing things that the eyes could never see before. And then William Harvey, who was a physician. William Harvey played a large role for a long time in history, it was considered unethical to do autopsies, so on the deceased, so post-mortem. And in 1448, whoever the Pope was at that time, was like Pius with some Roman numerals after it, I don't remember what. So said that there was no theological issues from a Catholic standpoint with doing post-mortem analysis on patients. So once that started, by the 1600s, you started to have a lot more information about the human body. He was an expert in the circulatory system. But what's important about that time is maybe prior to that, there was a little bit more respect for what we call the Aristotelian science. So, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But there was a major shift in the way that we start to think about the world at that time, okay? And it very much continues on to this current day. What we call the mechanistic conception of nature. And I'm going to show the next slide. This is, anyone know who this is? It's René Descartes. So René Descartes, a really impressive human being. So he was a scientist, he was a mathematician, and he was a philosopher. So he's what we call a polymath. He was an expert in multiple different areas. So really intelligent human being. He knew a lot of the scientists that I've mentioned here. He was kind of the center of a lot of this. So that's René Descartes. I was out in my yard the other day, and there's a guy that walked by. He's like in his 30s, looked just like this. He was smoking a pipe, and he stopped and made some comments on the architecture of our home, and then kept walking. And I was thinking, I pulled up the slide. I was like, that was René Descartes. He's back. So that's right. So René Descartes and a lot of the scientists at the time, they adopted what's called a mechanistic conception of nature. So one way that you could think about this is if you consider like a watch. So this is a digital watch, but if you consider a mechanical watch. So if someone asks you, maybe one of my kids asked me, Dad, how do the hands move on the watch? Well, you'd look at it, you observe it, and you'd say, well, there are these cog wheels under there and these interlocking wheels, and they move, and that causes the hands to move. And they say, well, Dad, how does the cog wheels, how do they move? They say, well, the cog wheels are made of such and such, and well, how do those things move? And you can kind of keep going all the way down, right, until you get to subatomic particles, right? And then, so it's this kind of bottom up, so you can explain how the things higher up work by the things down below, okay? And some people would look at the universe and say, the universe is really just like a big complex watch, things pushing and pulling on each other. The larger things can be explained by smaller things, and those things explained by even smaller things, and so on, all the way down, and you kind of have this bottom-up causality, okay? So when you get down to those most fundamental levels, like subatomic particles, the idea would be a lot of the things that we notice with our sense experience or just through life. So things like qualitative things, like what things feel like, smell like, colors and things like that, are no longer present at those subatomic levels, okay? Subjective experiences, so kind of what it feels like to be you, to eat, to taste things. So at the subatomic level, no such thing would exist. We have intentions, so like you intended to come to this lecture tonight, right? And we followed through with this. But such things don't exist according to the mechanistic conception of nature at the most kind of fundamental levels, okay? So there's no qualitative, subjective, or intentional properties. Things are determined by the laws of nature, okay? So Descartes he picks up on this, and he looks at the human person, and Descartes was Catholic, and he looked at the human person, and he wanted to make sense of this mechanistic world with the human person, who seems to not fit within this mechanistic world, okay? So he looked at the human body, and he called that res extensa, meaning it's extended. So he thought about it as it's material, it's extended in space, and it's mechanical, just like the rest of the universe, okay? So it's kind of like machine-like. But then he said that wouldn't really account for what a human being is. There must be this other substance. So you have the substance of the body, but there must be this other substance, and these two substances together make a human person. And so he would say that there's a mind. And when Descartes talks about a soul, that's kind of synonymous with mind, okay? So he would say the mind, it's immaterial. It's not made of matter. It's non-extended because it's not made of matter, and it's conscious, okay? It's aware, all right? So he would get things, psychological attributes, so things like emotions, beliefs, desires, acts of the will, thoughts, and he would say that those things, those psychological attributes reside within the mind, okay? But the body does not have those attributes, okay? The body is more machine-like, and then the mind kind of has these other capacities. It's more sophisticated than that, but there's been like the ghost in the machine is sometimes what people would refer to this view as. So Cartesian dualism, substance dualism. So your psychological attributes, the stuff that makes you, would kind of localize to this immaterial mind. So when it comes down to it, like the human person is really their mind, according to René Descartes, okay? But there's been no shortage of criticism of this view. Okay, so they're within neuroscience. I don't know if there are any Cartesian dualists. Probably not. There's probably some out there, but I think it would be a very rare position to hold. Okay, so there's many criticisms, and you could write a whole book on the criticisms of this theory. I'll just maybe say just a few briefly. So one of them is what's called the mereological fallacy. The mereological fallacy is when you erroneously ascribe an attribute to a part of a thing that only makes sense of the whole of the thing, okay? So I'll give you an example. So this is from Bennett and Hacker. And so they say, so we're just, again, Descartes saying that we're really just our mind, okay? But he says, it's not my mind that makes up its mind or decides. It is not my mind that calls something to mind and recollects. And it's not my mind that turns its mind to something or other and thinks. It is I, this person. So when we get these psychological attributes and we ascribe them to the mind, it's not really the mind that does these things. It's the whole human person who does these things. So that would be the neurological fallacy. We're going to see that again when we get to physicalism, the idea that we're just physical beings. We're going to see the neurological fallacy come up again. It hits both of these philosophies, okay? There are some ethical considerations, too. So if our cognitive capacities are really synonymous with our mind, as we age, our mental faculties start to diminish. Okay, so I'm a neurologist. So people very early in life, so we're thinking babies in the womb or infants or people who suffer brain damage midway through life or people who develop dementia towards the end of life. They have diminishing or not yet realized cognitive capacities, right? But it would be very difficult to find equality if we're really just our mind and our cognitive faculties differ so much amongst each other. It'd be very difficult to find equality there, right? Because we all have kind of different capacities of the mind, different intellectual capacities. Okay, so there'd be some great difficulties there. I think we see this. I remember I was in the hospital, so I'm our stroke director at our hospital, and we had a patient who, probably in her 80s or 90s, who was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and she was having an acute stroke, so they brought her into the emergency department, and they weren't treating her all that well, or one of the paramedics, and I just overheard her say, "Don't worry what you say about her. She's going to forget it in 3 seconds anyways." So these are not just kind of philosophical ideas, right? They have, this was someone who was dehumanized with that comment, right? So it's important kind of how we approach patients. And if you kind of believe that a person is really just their mind, I think it does influence how we treat patients, okay? But then there are a lot of rebuttals to Descartes' position from neuroscience. So that's more my field. So neuroscience doesn't really start taking off until the 1800s. The reason why, so neuroanatomy, you start seeing a lot of discoveries in the 1500s and 1600s, but the brain remains a complete mystery. The reason is, so when I was a medical student, we would get cadavers. So those are people who donate their body after death. And there's a whole preservation process that occurs when you donate your body. And what happened was when I got my cadaver, it wasn't done properly, whether it was refrigeration or the chemicals that they used to preserve. So what happened was when I took the skull off of my cadaver, the brain had liquefied from not being preserved properly, and it just poured out. So I couldn't use it. Now, imagine the time where there was no refrigeration, there was no electricity, and there were no chemicals to preserve the body. Well, the brain just always looked like that anytime you looked at it. It looked it didn't look impressive, right? So it was kind of a mystery on how it functioned, right? But that began to change. So what they began doing in the 1800s, even a little bit earlier than that, is when you would have a criminal who was executed, you would grab the body and you'd put it on ice as quickly as you could, and then you would remove the skull, and you could then start looking at the brain before it kind of turns to mush, okay? So there was this guy, Pierre-Paul Broca, who followed this man for a number of years. Unknown to him, the man had a stroke. He had syphilis, and he had a stroke as a result of syphilis. And that stroke caused an impairment in his language. So this man could only say one word, and that word was tan. It's the only word he could say. Repeat after me. Today is a sunny day. Tan. Where are you today? Tan. So everyone called him Tan because people weren't very nice back then, okay? So they called him Tan. And so Broca followed Tan for a number of years. And then when Tan died, he put him on ice. He removed his skull. And he looked at the brain. He says, wherever I see damage in the brain, that's where language capacity must be, right? So he looks at it, and he sees necrosis, cell death, in the posterior inferior frontal gyrus on the left. And he says, this must be where expressive language function is. okay? And it is. And we call that area Broca's area today, okay? So this method, the clinical pathological method, kind of catches on. So in Germany, Karl Wernicke does the same thing. There's a man who, he can speak, but his speech makes absolutely no sense. It's a complete word salad. No one understands what the person's saying, and the person doesn't understand anything that's being said to him. So Wernicke does the same thing. And when he looks into the brain, he sees necrosis in the superior temporal lobe. And he says, this must be where receptive language is, okay? So this method continues on and on and on. We learn more and more, okay? So you lose some function because of some pathology, such as a stroke, and then you look and you see where the damage is. And that's the area that gives you that capacity. So it's a very simple method, and it catches on, okay? So, and it's played a major role today. So this is a brain, and there's the skull. Hopefully this doesn't bother anyone as you're eating. So this is called the Montreal procedure. So say, for example, someone has epilepsy. So they have a seizure disorder where you get a surge of electrical activity in the brain. And what you want to do in these circumstances, if it's not delicate cortex, you want to cut it out to stop the seizures, okay? So, and I've been in on these surgeries. When I was at Indiana University, we actually did a lot of these, and the neurologist would help with the brain mapping and following along with what we call EEG. And so what you would do is you'd have a person, they had epilepsy or a brain tumor, whatever the reason that you're doing this for, and you'd put them to sleep. And then what you would do is you'd remove part of the skull and the dural layers, and you'd make your way down to the brain, and then you'd wake the patient up, okay? It's pretty wild. There's no pain receptors on the brain, so it doesn't hurt, okay? And then what you do is you use a probe, and you stimulate parts of the brain. And when you would stimulate parts of the brain, the person who's awake will tell you what they're experiencing, okay? So they'd say, I feel my arm is numb when you do that. Or in the temporal lobe, I'm hearing music, okay? Or I'm having a flashback of my childhood. Or, hey, you just moved my arm, okay? So the person is a very, very bizarre experience, even for like watching it. It's almost like an out-of-body experience, just watching this happen, right? So this is the Montreal procedure. It was invented by Penfield and some colleagues in Canada in the early 1900s, okay? And this really did a lot for confirming kind of where certain things localize within the brain. So this was kind of huge in terms of understanding neuroanatomy. So this was kind of early 1900s. So when you move on, I spent a lot of time reading these. So these are electroencephalograms, or we call EEGs. So these are brain waves. So if someone has a stroke or they're having a seizure, you can see where they're coming from in the brain without having to open the brain or do anything like that. These are EEGs. So this was invented in 1932 by Hans Berger, and really caught on in the 1950s. So this is good at kind of localizing certain functions of the brain. These are CT scans. So one's a CT angiogram. These are blood vessels going up to the brain. I read these every day, all day, looking for blockage, a blockage if we need to remove a clot or something like that. So I'll spend a lot of time looking at these images. And then CT scans as well, looking at those all day, every day. So looking for strokes and such. So again, that further advances things, helps us localize where certain damage is to the brain. MRI comes out. The technology goes back to like the 1940s, 1949, but these really don't come into play until mostly the 90s. It's even still today, some hospitals don't have MRI. They're very, very expensive. But MRI is really breathtaking. I mean, it's almost like you're holding the brain or looking at slices of the brain. It's so accurate in terms of the anatomy. So there are wonderful ways in which someone has some type of behavioral abnormality, they have weakness or numbness or deficits in language or speech or all sorts of different things. And we can get an MRI and we can figure out what part of the brain is dysfunctional, okay? So we have all these ways of further looking at the brain. Functional MRIs came out in the kind of late 90s, really took off in the early 2000s. And this is a way of, so everything else, you look at the brain in a static way, except for EEG, but you look at the brain in a static way, like it's a still picture. This, however, is not. This is kind of live. So you have someone in a scanner, and here they're saying a bunch of verbs. So they're just saying verbs. So they're using expressive language, and you can take a picture, and you can just see what part of the brain is lighting up, and the idea is that's the part of the brain that's active, that's working. So you can look, and you can say, oh, okay, the posterior inferior frontal gyrus has a lot more blood flow going to it. That means it must be more active. So that's where that localizes in the left hemisphere. So, we'll use these things. So here we have Broca's area, and then there's Wernicke's area, which is the other kind of orangish red area. Okay. So what you can do now is you can have someone do a functional MRI, and you want to know, what areas of the brain are responsible for pain? Or romantic love. So you can have someone go into a MRI and show them a picture of their loved one, and you can take some pictures, and you say, love localizes to the anterior cingulate gyrus, the insula, the caudate, the putamen, and the cerebellum. Okay? Empathy, wisdom. These studies are actually like really ridiculous for the most part, but I won't get into that. So, all right. Okay. So that's it for the slide. I just wanted to show you some neuroimaging so that you guys would just be able to see it and kind of just see what we look at throughout the day. So if you imagine if René Descartes was sitting at a table with a bunch of neuroscientists, René would maybe start to tell them, all these psychological attributes, they localize to this immaterial mind. But then the neuroscientist would say, no, look at these scans. They localize right there. You see them, and you just kind of point and say, love, it's right there and there. Wisdom, it's over there. Right? Now, I don't think René Descartes would fall for that. He was a really brilliant guy. But that would be the argument, that our psychological attributes that once localized to the mind, now neuroscience has shown that they don't localize to some immaterial mind, because that doesn't exist. They localize to the brain. Okay? So that would be the idea. And that we have evidence for this now, that we can see it on scans. All right? So that would be kind of one of the criticisms of Cartesian dualism. And to some extent, so we call this physicalism, which a really simple definition of physicalism would be like, you all are purely physical. There's no immaterial component to your being. You're purely made of matter, okay? And that's it. There's no immaterial soul. There's no immaterial mind. You're made of matter, okay? So that would be the idea of physicalism. All right, and there are many different types of physicalism. I think at face value, this is attractive in one way, attractive in terms of simplicity. So as a neurologist, it can make sense because I see brain damage on a daily basis, and when I see brain damage, I often see mind damage, right? They usually go together, and it's easy to just say, well, they're the same thing, okay? The mind is just the brain. I see, again. And when I have to declare brain death as being a neurologist, and your heart can still be going, your lungs can still be going, and your other organ systems can still be going. But if your brain is dead, you are dead, okay? So it's very easy just to see, like, when the brain dies, the mind dies. When the brain has damage, the mind has damage. Maybe they're the same thing, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, good. But is this an adequate explanation, right? Is this a good explanation for our human capacities? I'm going to say it's not, okay? So I'll give you some examples. So let's say I want to tell you all a love story, which I'm going to. My wife is here today. So if someone was to ask me, how did you fall in love? Everyone's like looking around like she's over there. But if someone was to ask me like, oh, hey, how'd you fall in love with your wife? And I said something like, so I'd say like, so I teach neuroanatomy and I do some like neurophysiology stuff as well. So just to back up a little bit. So like neuroanatomy, what we're talking about in neuroanatomy is like structures in the brain. So like as I'm talking to you guys right now, there are like certain structures in my brain that are at play. So like, yeah, that Broca's area, right? The posterior inferior frontal gyrus, what we call my cortical bulbar tract, cranial nerves, the muscles in my tongue, the muscles in my mouth, my vocal cords. These are material things that give me the capacity to speak to you, okay? And we call that a material cause, okay? And then there's also what's called an efficient cause of me speaking to you, okay? And that's like the firing of action potentials within those structures that I mentioned and the flow of blood. It's that which brings about an action, okay? So we call it the efficient cause. And scientists would say, that's all there is. There's material causes and there are efficient causes, and that's it, okay? So if that's it, I should be able to tell you my love story in material and efficient causality, and that should be adequate. So let's try it, okay? So if you're like, okay, how do you fall in love with Nicole? Let's say something like, well, I was in Estes Park, Colorado, and it was a sunny day, and the light rays reflected off of Nicole's face, and they hit my retinal ganglion cells. And once they hit my retinal ganglion cells, they depolarized and sent an action potential down my optic nerve, which went through my optic chiasm to my optic tracts, to the lateral geniculate nuclei of the thalami, and then into the inferior and superior optic radiations. And then from there, it went to the primary visual cortex. Hold on. And then they went through the ventral stream to my fusiform gyrus. My fusiform gyrus recognized her face as beautiful. And then from there, my caudate nucleus depolarized like it's never has in my entire life. And then when that happened, it sent signals to my insular cortex. And the insular cortex increased sympathetic tone in my body, which went to my adrenal glands. And I released more catecholamines, which increased my cardiac output. And then it increased the mean kinetic energy in my chest, and I felt warmth, right? So that would be a really bad love story, okay? Although entertaining, right? And if you said, I don't understand a word you just said, could you explain that differently? Okay, let me tell you the difference between electrical, synaptic transmission. Let's bring it down to a cellular level, and I'll explain it to you there. Well, you still would have no further help in understanding why I have fallen in love with my wife, right? We're no closer to understanding this whatsoever, okay? So there's something missing, okay? All right, so why would this be inadequate? Well, it's very simple. So for two things to be identical, they need to be the same. So for love to be identical to neural tissue, they need to be the same. They need to have all the same properties. So if love has properties that neural tissue does not have, then they can't be the same, okay? It's that simple, okay? So when we talk about physical things like a neuron, neurons have quantitative components, right? So they can be measured. They take up space. They have a certain volume. They can be to the right or to the left of another neuron, okay? So yeah, they have mass and they take up volume. They're objective. So that means they're totally open to third-person analysis, right? So we can talk about the axons and the dendrites and the synaptic clefts, and we can look at them and know everything about them in theory if we were to study them enough, okay? They're determined. So an axon doesn't decide to fire. It just fires, okay? There's no decision that the neuron is saying, all right, let's go. I'm ready. I'm going to fire right now. Doesn't happen. There's no intentionality. But what about mental states? Emotions, beliefs, desires, acts of the will, and all the many thoughts we can have. We can have analytical thoughts, discerning thoughts, reflective thoughts, planning, problem solving, all these types of things that require thoughts, intentionality, okay? So if we look at things like neurons, again, they're quantitative. They take up mass and they take up volume. But what about some of our thoughts? So say, for example, the formation of a concept. So remember, material things, they all have a certain size. They all can be measured and they take up volume. But can a concept be measured, and does it take up volume? So Marie George, who's a philosopher at St. John, and she's one of the speakers at the Thomistic Institute, has a good example in which she talks about small dogs are smaller than big dogs, right? That's really obvious, right? We can imagine a big dog and a small dog in our mind, and the image of the big dog is bigger than that of the small dog, perhaps. But the concept, big dog and small dog, there's no difference whatsoever in size because concepts don't have sizes. It doesn't make sense to say that's a big concept or something. We say it metaphorically, but we don't really mean it, right? Concepts they don't take up volume, okay? They're not something that can be measured, okay? So that's another difference that we see. Again, physical things are quantitative, mass and volume. But human beings have qualitative components, right? What it's like. So imagine that someone in this room has never tasted chocolate before, okay? It's terrible, right? And we all, as a group right here, are trying to explain to that person who's never tasted chocolate what chocolate tastes like. But we can only use third-person objective facts, right? So we talk about the molecular structure of chocolate. We talk about how it affects our taste buds and the smell of it and how it travels to the periform, area of the temporal lobe. Would they have any idea what chocolate tastes like? No, of course they wouldn't have any idea what chocolate tastes like. They need to taste it. They need the qualitative component. So if you can explain every single physical fact about something and not know what it is, and you've exhausted all the physical descriptions, and you can still learn something else by tasting the thing, then that thing can't be physical if you've already exhausted all the physical stuff, okay? And then, again, things are objective. They're totally open to the public. But then there's this subjective component to people, okay? So again, if my wife is here, I could know every physical thing about my wife. I could know her neuroanatomy. I could know her neurophysiology. I could know all of those things. But if my wife doesn't talk to me and tell me who she is and share with me the private interior life, I will in no way know very much about her in a meaningful way at all, okay? So when we just talk about material causes and efficient causes, we just never really get there, okay? We never really get there. So, yeah, I think just like the mind is kind of our intellectual capacities are really amazing. In the Confessions, I don't know how many of you have read the Confessions, but there's this really confusing chapter, book 10 of the Confessions, which is my favorite book in the Confessions. But Augustine just marvels at our human capacities. He does it in a way that is unbelievable for someone in that century to be able to write like that and have that kind of awareness of the human person. And of course, we see this with Aquinas later, but it's one of those first very kind of this beautiful introspective awareness of self that Augustine displays in Book 10. But if you just think about something like, when I became Catholic, I had a spiritual director who was trained. I know this is the Thomistic Institute, so don't get mad, but she was trained in Ignatian spiritual practices. All right, so you guys okay with that? All right, so so she would, we would for a long time, anyways, do these kind of Ignatian, kind of more like mindfulness thing, right? So. But it's very interesting. It does help you just understand how the human person operates. So you would start, for example, in a relaxed position. And you would attend to different regions of your body, right? You would attend to your feet, and you can feel your feet. And then you can move up your body after relaxing your feet and move to your knees. And you can feel certain things in your environment. You can attend to them and then kind of let them go. You can listen to the birds outside, and you can do all of these things. You can, if you're sipping coffee, you can taste the coffee. So there's all these sensory pathways that we have that make their way to the brain. Okay, I have to teach these to medical students, but there are all these sensory pathways that kind of make their way to the brain. We can attend to those, and it's really, really cool. But I think. Animals have sensations, so it doesn't really make us stand out from animals. They too can sense things, oftentimes much better than we can as human beings, and in very impressive ways. So we have these certain sensations, and then those sensations we can, in the act of mindfulness, we can examine our day. So we talked about the examine prayers that are kind of taught in Jesuit high schools and things like that, right? And it's interesting. You can examine your day. You can draw forth memories from your day, and you can play it back like a film. And you have all these memories, and they can produce images, and you can look at these images, and all of that is rich interior experience. You can draw up emotions. Say, for example, there was a sadness in the morning, but then you saw that sadness turn to joy, and you can look upon that sadness and feel a sense of joy while looking at sadness. So we're getting to these kind of higher cognitive capacities. And then if you looked at someone like Aristotle or Aquinas, they're going to talk about these intellectual capacities that really set us apart. So when we sense something, we sense a particular thing. Where we hear a bird, we hear a particular bird, okay? When we have a memory, it's a particular memory, or we draw forth a particular image, right? But humans and animals can do all of this. But humans have this kind of different level in which I can, if I hear a bird, I can contemplate birdness. Like, I can contemplate universal truths about birds. I can draw forth mathematical principles and contemplate math. I can do all of these things. You can sit in this lecture right now and understand what's being said, okay? This is uniquely human. So we have this intellect and will. One of the interesting things about this, and it's not strictly an argument, I think, for the soul, but this kind of transcendence, that you can watch your thoughts float by and analyze them and kind of transcend almost the self, right? And you can kind of gaze upon it and watch it, right? It's very interesting. A neuroscientist might say something like, well, let's put you in the functional MRI, and they'll show you a picture of what's going on in your central nervous system while you're doing a mindfulness activity or something, right? And they'd say, it's right there. But then you could start to, while you're in the MRI, if you were able to see the images yourself, you can actually start to contemplate the images on the screen, which is happening in your brain at that moment, and rise above it. So it's very interesting. It's very hard to reconcile how you can reduce a human person to part of their central nervous system if they can transcend and contemplate their central nervous system. How can that which transcends a thing be part of that thing, right? It's very difficult to try to understand that, right? Like makes your brain hurt, okay? Physical things, again, they're determined like a row of dominoes. The physical world is determined by antecedents from going back to the Big Bang, okay, and controlled by laws of nature. But human beings are not this way. We have true freedom. You chose to come to this lecture. We choose various things, okay? So we have this intentionality. We talk about love. A lot of times love is a choice that we make. It's not just an emotion. It's a choice to will the good of the other as other, okay? So there's this deep intentionality. We make real, meaningful choices through deliberation, okay? But physical things are not that way. We talked about the neurological fallacy. And again, that's where you erroneously ascribe a part of a thing that really only makes sense when it's ascribed to the whole of the thing. This is extremely common in neuroscience, where people will say things like, the hippocampus remembers, the fusiform gyrus sees faces, okay? No, the human person, in having a hippocampus, remembers things. The human person, in having a fusiform gyrus, can recognize faces. There's a big difference there. Your fusiform gyrus doesn't see anything. You do, okay? You know, if you were to break up with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, you know, it's you breaking up with your boyfriend. It's not the ventral medial prefrontal cortex doing it, right? It's you, right? So, and again, kind of ethical considerations. So if we say a person is just their brain, it also results in major ethical implications if we reduce a person to their brain. So remember I had a patient who had what's called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. She's still my patient. And when I first met her, this was 4 years ago, she was having over 1,000 seizures a day. Okay, that's a lot of seizures, right? And so I think she had been to a number of epileptologists, those are seizure doctors, and they just kind of changed her medications around endlessly, but her seizures, they never got better, right? And some people say, well, why does being Catholic make a difference when you're a doctor? Like, why does it make a difference? Well, because you see the person, no matter what, you see them as a person made in the image of God, right? So when my patient comes to me, she's nonverbal, So I make sure to really listen to the parents. The parents have been caring for her for 49 years, okay, through her Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So I listen to them. And they say, doctor, we've been to doctor after doctor, and they switch her medicines around. She gets worse. And I did have to switch her medicines around because they were not the right ones to be on. However, I listened to them. They said, you know what? Her seizures almost always are worse when she's constipated. And I was like, okay, let's address that. But this has never been done, right? Something so simple. So I said, okay, we're going to change your medicines around. We're going to really focus on constipation because that seems to bring about all of these seizures. She's pretty much seizure-free now. But I can't help to think that when people with these severe disabilities and intellectual impairments go doctor to doctor over the years, I wonder what they see. Like, are they seeing a human person in all of their dignity, made in the image of God, who is of equal dignity and worth compared to everyone else, right? So, yeah, so I think, like, if you reduce a person to their brain, obviously not all brains are equal, right? There are no two brains that are the same, so equality is absolutely impossible, okay? And I think equality is completely impossible in materialism or physicalism. It's just, I can't think of a way in which that could occur. I'd love to hear if someone here thinks that it can. Be all ears. So there's this tendency in medicine, if any of you go into medicine, especially occurs when you're a resident, you often start seeing a person as an organ. At first, you kind of see them as this physical thing, but then you even reduce them further to an organ. This is if you're on your GI month, you're like, this is a 57-year-old liver coming in with Wilson's disease. So you start reducing the person to their organs, right? This is not good. This is not good, but it happens, and it starts in residency. But imagine you get that same person and you brought them to an art museum, right? And they're looking at all the beautiful art around, and they say something like, that's just a bunch of silicon oxide and calcium such and such. Like, that would be crazy, right? If they didn't appreciate the beauty of the art and they just cared about the chemical composition, they made no words whatsoever about what it represents, the beauty of it, how it goes beyond itself, and all of this. So we can't do that with art, but for some reason it's permitted to do that with a human person, right? Who's made in the image of God. So this is not acceptable, right? It's important to know as well that correlations do not equal identity. So in any cognitive task any of you do, okay, we're always going to see a correlation in the brain. Okay, this is not surprising, all right? But that doesn't mean that thing that correlates is identical to the thing. So the number one cause of stroke is high blood pressure, but high blood pressure is not a stroke, okay? Neuroscience is always going to continue to find correlations between mental states and brain states, but identity can never be established if the properties are not the same, okay? So if, in summary, on this section, if humans have qualitative, intentional, and subjective properties, and matter does not, then a human being cannot be purely material. Okay? So there are other views as well. So there's a whole bunch of different views within physicalism. And then there are also views, which I won't have time to discuss. I usually speak too long. So that the brain is not the same as the mind, but the brain in all of its complexity generates the mind. Okay? As an epiphenomenon. Okay? Or an emergent property, or an emergent substance. And if we have time in the Q&A, we can go through those things, okay? That's a different view, that the brain is not the same as the mind. It produces it, it generates it as a separate substance, entity, property, and such, okay? Okay. So I'd like to propose, kind of through the way of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, how I think we can better think about the human person, okay? So I want to move into that. So how we can see the human person more holistically in the way that really includes the richness of being human. So I talked about the material causes, right? So as I'm speaking to you again, there are these neuroanatomical structures that give me the capacity to speak to you. My left inferior frontal gyrus, cortical bulbar tract, spinal, cranial nerves, all that kind of stuff permits me to speak to you guys. Those are the material causes. In addition to that, the efficient causes, which is the neuronal activity occurring within those material causes. Okay? So I think one of the mistakes that neuroscientists make is they don't understand the difference between necessity and sufficiency. So those things are necessary for me to talk to you, but they're not sufficient. Like when I drove here today, the gasoline in my car was necessary for me to get here, but it was not sufficient. I needed tires, an engine, and many other components to allow me to get here. So that's the difference between sufficiency and necessity. Okay? So when you think about like functional MRIs, would any of you be surprised if I was like, hey, where's Jacob? Where's Jacob go? Jacob, would you be surprised if I told you that when you're thinking, your brain is doing something? No. Would you be surprised if I said, when you're thinking certain things or doing certain tasks, there's a particular area in your brain that's more active than other areas of your brain? No, none of this is surprising, right? So due to these like Google algorithms, I get these, like if I go on Google and it like tells you like the current events going on that they're all like neuroscience stuff. And it's like, scientists have discovered love in the brain. Scientists have discovered wisdom. And these are like correlations that they find on imaging when someone's doing something, right? But when I read these, I chuckle because this is the same thing as like, from my vantage point, this is the same thing as saying something like, scientists have discovered when human beings walk, they use their legs, right? Like this is not surprising. Or it may be more specific, something like, scientists have discovered that you use your tibialis anterior muscle to dorsiflex your foot while you're walking. And it's like, oh, wow, great. I didn't know that, but that's great information. Thank you. That's all it does for me. But for some reason, the general public is like really impressed with these things. And the brain's a mystery, and sure, I get it. But I wouldn't make too much of this, okay? So I would propose that we think about this in an Aristotelian or Thomistic way. And kind of as a pedagogical method, I'll start with something very simple and move to the more complex. So if you imagine something like a desk, to fully know what a desk is, we'd want to posit 4 causes for the desk. There's the material cause. We've discussed material causes. The material cause of the desk is wood, okay? We talk about the efficient cause, which is that which brought the thing about by way of action. So we would say like a carpenter or a machine or hammers and nails, okay? Those are the efficient causes. Some of those are material causes, right? But would that really explain it? No. We would need to posit what's called a formal cause, okay? And when we're talking about an artifact like a table, we would say something like the table is rectangular. It has 4 legs. So we'd be talking about the shape and the contour of the table. Okay, but we still don't really know, because maybe someone comes there, they've never seen a table before, and they say, what do you use it for? So then we talk about the final cause of the table. The final cause of the table is the purpose of the table. It's to sit at, it's to eat at, it's to study at, okay? So that would be the 4 causes. So we have a material cause, an efficient cause, a formal cause, and final cause, okay? All right, so we're going to kind of move up a little bit in complexity, and we're going to talk kind of about how this applies to, say, me speaking to you. So again, we talked about the neuroanatomical structures involved with my speaking to you, okay? So I won't repeat those for your sake. And then we talked about the efficient causes, so like the neurophysiology that's occurring in those structures. So then we would talk about the formal cause of me speaking to you now. Okay, so what's the formal cause? So the formal cause, that aspect of speaking to you, so it entails my thoughts, my intentions, using my intellect. In using my intellect, I organize and unify and direct my thoughts in a meaningful way to communicate with you. Okay? There's an intention communicating with you. And through this process, there are many potential things that I want to say. And those potential things, through thought and deliberation, become actualized. And I say those things. I could say this or I could say that, but I choose to say this. Okay? So that would be the formal cause. And the formal cause gives kind of a shape and a contour to what I'm saying. It gives meaning to it. Okay? It makes what I'm saying intelligible. Okay? A bunch of wood kind of heaped together and all of that isn't a table. It has no intelligibility. It has no form. Okay? So if I was just up here just saying a bunch of nonsense, it would have no form, no shape, no context, okay? So that would be the formal cause of my speaking to you. And the final cause is the purpose of my speaking to you. It's teleological. It has a purpose. It's aimed at something, which is the exchange of ideas or understanding the Thomistic and Aristotelian view of the human person, okay? So that would be the final cause. So those are the 4 causes of my speaking to you, okay? And this single act of speaking to you entails 4 aspects: material, efficient, formal, and final. This is not the interaction of 2 substances contra Descartes, okay? Rather, these are 4 aspects of one event happening in one substance, this person. Some of those things are material, and some of those acts are immaterial, okay? But it's one substance, okay? And some people say, oh boy, immaterial stuff, what's the evidence of that? But I'd say, like, when's the last time you've tripped over a proposition? When's the last time you hit your head on the general theory of relativity, okay? If Nicole asked me to go to the grocery store and she writes a list, and then on that list it says, pick up 3 facts, I'm not going to come home with that. And she can't blame me because it makes no sense. You can't pick up facts, okay? You can't put them in your cart, okay? All right? Because they're not material things. You're never going to find the law of non-contradiction in your test tube. It's not going to be there, okay? Because it's not a physical thing. Mathematics, things like 2 + 2 = 4, is not a physical thing. It's also not just a concept that's in our mind. If everyone dies, and therefore there are no concepts left in our minds because everyone's dead, 2 + 2 remains 4, okay? These are not physical things. So all we're saying here is that there are immaterial things, and some of these immaterial things display personhood, okay? Yeah, so I don't think it's a radical claim, all right? So that's kind of level 1, the desk. Level 2 is kind of the capacities that we have. Level 3 requires understanding of a complete metaphysical framework, so it's always hard to talk about this. But this would be understanding kind of how someone like Aquinas and St. Thomas kind of see the world as a whole. So they would reject the mechanistic conception of nature, which was present at that time, okay? So you have the ancient atomists that were prior to Aristotle, Democritus and then Lucretius. I don't know if that was after Aristotle, and Epicurus. So they're atomists. They think everything's made out of these small invisible things called atoms. Kind of impressive, right? So they were aware of these philosophies already, okay? And that was before the time of Christ, okay? So it's a rejection of that theory. So Aristotle said there's really no such thing as, like, matter outside of, like, there's no standalone matter. So Aristotle said everything that is a substance, okay? Everything that is made out of matter and form, okay? Matter and form. That's called hylomorphism, okay? So this is a whole metaphysical kind of idea of how the world works. So there's form and there's matter. So matter represents the potential of a substance, and form represents the principle of actuality. So you have this kind of intelligibility that directs, informs, and organizes the matter of a substance to become this or that, okay? This is a very odd view. I actually believe this view, but it is odd when you first hear it. It takes like a couple of years of wrestling with it. There's a Thomistic Institute speaker, Robert Kuhns, and Ed Feser as well. So these are 2 excellent philosophers. And Robert Kuhns studies the metaphysics of quantum mechanics, which seems like really, I don't know, that's great. So I don't fully understand what he's talking about, but what it seems like from a simplistic standpoint is when you get down to the most fundamental things, so you get these subatomic particles like quarks and so on, when you get down to the lowest level, you don't really have anything that's made of anything. You have something like pure potentiality, okay? It's neither here nor there. It's neither this nor that, okay, at the very, very lowest level. But then how does it become this or that thing, okay? And the idea is there's intelligibility, or kind of like this intelligible form that kind of speaks into the system in a top-down causation to determine what it's going to be, okay? So this is kind of at that quantum level, all right? So again, it would take time to learn about that. But what Aquinas and Aristotle would say is, yeah, there's a material aspect to our bodies. There's neurons and such, and these have certain potentials. But these potentials are actualized by our formal aspect, okay, which Aristotle and Aquinas refer to as a soul, okay? So the soul is that which actualizes the potential of matter to become that which is to become, okay? So that's a form. But if it's a living thing, we call it a soul, okay? It's that which gives life, okay? So the soul is not synonymous with Plato and Descartes. It's not a separate substance. It's not an emergent substance or a property. A soul doesn't even need to be immaterial, such as in non-human life. Okay, so plants and animals would have souls. It's just that which gives life, but it doesn't need to be immaterial. In humans, however, the soul is immaterial because it has certain capacities that matter does not have, even on an Aristotelian framework. Okay? Yeah, and then Aquinas makes all sorts of arguments for that. Okay? So I think it's important, just as you're going, I don't know how many of you are in the sciences, but just to kind of realize the sciences are not this kind of standalone enterprise. The sciences are contingent upon philosophy. Okay? So when I do science, I'm using the laws of logic. Okay? But science does not prove the laws of logic. It relies on the laws of logic. Okay? I have faith that my sensory input is accurate. So I see certain things and I touch certain things, and that's how information gets into my central nervous system, and it's the ingredients for which my intellect can play with and make sense of the world. But I have no way of proving that's accurate. Okay? There's no way to actually know that our senses are actually accurate. Okay? Science assumes that when we see effects, there's always a cause, okay? And science is good at finding causes, but it cannot prove that there is a cause, okay? That's a philosophical claim, okay? Science, so we believe that the universe is intelligible. That's what allows science to function. We assume that when we do science, we're going to find intelligibility, and we do, okay? But science does not make the universe intelligible. It just finds that it is, okay? And that's a metaphysical question, okay, which I think has a theological basis, okay? Science does not inform ethics. Ethics informs science, okay? Again, I have faith that I'm giving medicines to patients all the time and doing procedures and all this type of stuff, and I'm having faith that the clinical trials were done ethically and they were done correctly. There's actually a shocking amount of fabricated studies in the medical literature. It's more than 20%. I know that. Okay. And in neuroscience, it's maybe even higher. Okay. So there's an enormous amount of plagiarized or just made up studies. Okay. So I have faith, although sometimes I question things about what I'm doing for patients, hoping that people they were ethical. They were virtuous people. Okay. And many times they're not. And that negatively affects patients. That's a lot of times. We'll do studies, and we try to replicate these studies, and we find that they're negative, although they were positive in the initial study, okay? So again, there's faith, okay? So it's important to have a broad perspective. Not everything can be reduced, okay? Poems can't be reduced to ink. Legal systems can't be reduced to brick and mortar. Paintings can't be reduced to silicon dioxide, okay? Music appreciation is not explained by the vibrations of air and the corresponding neurological response to that, okay? And love is not reduced to oxytocin, okay? And dopamine and various neurons, okay? So not everything can be reduced. There are some things that are irreducible, okay? So in regards to neuroscience, I'm very grateful for it. That's what I do. It's tremendously helpful for patient care. I rely on it every day, okay? But the job of neuroscience is not to make metaphysical conclusions. It's not to make what we call ontological and causal reductions. That's philosophy. That's not neuroscience. Neuroscientists have no business doing that, okay? Neuroscience looks at the physical, the chemical, the biological substratum for our human capacities, the material and efficient causes of what we can do, okay? But it's not to make comments regarding formal causality or final causality. That's outside of the scheme of science. It's outside of the scientific method, okay? So the last little bit here, I'm just going to talk about the theological implications of this, which I hinted at some. In Genesis 1:27, we read, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." So the Catholic tradition has held that, when you ask, like, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? So the Bible tells us we're made in the image of God, but it doesn't tell us what that means, okay? It doesn't tell us what it means to be made in the image of God. So the Catholic tradition has always held that it means that we have what's called a rational soul. So this is from St. Augustine. Man's excellence consists in the fact that God made him in his own image by giving him a rational soul, which raises him above the beasts of the field. Okay? So we talked a little bit about that. Aquinas says something similar. Okay? So in having a rational soul, we have an intellect and we have a will. And our intellects are amazing. We can look to the exterior, like in St. Thomas's 5 ways, and we can look at the world around us with our intellect, and we can look at things like, we see that there are things that are contingent. Can there only be contingent things, or must there be a necessary thing? If there is a necessary thing, that is what we call God. Or we see that there are things that are caused by other things, okay? Can there just be an endless, infinite regress of causes, or must there be something that's uncaused? I mean, again, we call that God. We can look and we can see teleology. We can see that things are aimed in a particular direction, okay? Even the evolutionary process has a particular aim to it. And those things often, Aquinas says, we can look and see that for things that lack intelligence to act with intelligence, they must be directed by something with intelligence. That's what we call God. We can see that things begin to exist, okay? And everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause, okay? So we can debate those things, but we can look out with our intellect and we can entertain these incredible ideas, right? And we can argue and debate them. We can look at the interior moral life and say, yeah, if there's objective morality, we may think that if there is objective morality, God must exist, and there's arguments there. We can look and say, yeah, I'm not just a material being. I have an immaterial component to my being, and everything that is has an adequate explanation on why it is and the attributes that it has. Well, what would be an adequate explanation for why I have an immaterial soul, right? I mean, it seems like God is a really good candidate if you start working that out in your mind, right? So we can look exteriorly, we can look interiorly with our intellect and come to wonderful conclusions. And this is part of what it means to being made in the image of God. We can kind of contemplate the eternal, like not just God, but even numbers, propositions, facts. When we can think about God and contemplate and pray and all of these things, right? And it's because we're created in God's image. It gives us the capacity to do these things. Okay? And I think being created in the image of God gives us infinite worth and dignity. There are a couple of objections to this. One of them is, okay, well, if you say that, well, what about an embryo, okay, or an infant? They can't display rationality, so do they have a rational soul? And the answer is yes, they do, because they're human. All humans have a rational soul. It's just that due to immaturity of the central nervous system or something along those lines, it's just that although they have a rational soul, the potentials cannot be actualized because of immaturity of the material constituents, yet it's still there, okay? So you don't need to display rationality in order to have a rational soul, okay? So that's an important note. Another one, though, which I think is a good objection, is, it can be reductive. So if that's all you mean by being created in the image of God, then it may be a little bit reductive, because we never go out there and we never meet a free will, or we never meet a rationality, or we never meet an intellect, although we use that term, okay? So it is a little bit reductive. So if you look at St. John Paul II, if you look at Pope Benedict XVI, they kind of expand on the human person. they talk about that we're relational beings. Everyone in here is a son or a daughter, a cousin or so on, right? That we have these relationships. And we also have a relationship to God, our creator. And the Trinity, God itself, is a relationship of three persons, right? So we're relational beings. And then each person is unique, okay? Every single person is unique. There's this wonderful passage in Isaiah. It says, "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." So God, in his divine speech, it's performative. What God utters comes to be. Like when I utter something, it doesn't come to be, right? But when God utters something in his intelligence through the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, it becomes that thing. So if you think of something in Catholic theology, the Eucharist, right? When Christ says, who has that same performative speech, when he says, "This is my body and this is my blood," he says that with performative speech, and it becomes that thing. But I think for each individual human person, God said something like, "Let there be a Sarah," or "Let there be an Isaac," or "Let there be," and so on, and that person came to be. Okay? So I think it's really beautiful to consider these things. Further, we have free will. We can choose between good and evil. We're moral agents. We're responsible. Okay, and this is rooted in our rational power. We deliberate, okay? And our freedom attains perfection when it's directed towards God, our beatitude. So we're made in the image of God. We're rational beings. We're relational beings. We're unique. All of these things kind of play a role in what it means to be a human, okay? And these are like mere brushstrokes of what it means to be human, okay? A human being is a mystery, right? Super rational is a mystery, okay? We can't fully comprehend what a human being is, okay? But in conclusion, I'd say we're made of body and soul as one unified substance. We're one person, and we're created in the image of God.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Thomistic Institute podcast. The generosity of people like you makes this podcast possible. If you enjoy these talks, please consider showing your support at www.thomisticinstitute.org/donate. Your donation of even $1 helps us reach more college students and many others with the powerful truths of the faith, and it ensures that we can keep publishing top-notch lectures on this podcast. Thanks a lot.